Severance begins with a question. Who are you? Mark says this to Helly, who is passed out on a table, slowly waking up. Mark then asks Helly if she would like to take a survey. Helly just wants to know who is speaking, and Mark continues to try to begin the survey. All during this time, Helly's just searching for a way out. Helly gives up and agrees to the 5 questions. Who are you? Helly doesn't know. In which state or U.S. territory were you born? Helly doesn't know. Name any state or U.S. territory. Delaware. What is Mr. Egan's favorite breakfast? She says that question makes no sense. To the best of your memory, what is the eye color of your mother? She doesn't know. Mark opens the door and says that's a perfect score. Then we see Mark in his car crying. He composes himself, he gets ready for work, and he walks into the building. He walks all the way down to the severed access floor, changes into his work clothes, and puts on his work watch, his work shoes, and he leaves his cell phone in the locker and heads on down towards the elevator. He gets wand, hops in the elevator, goes down, and then all of a sudden we hear a sharp noise, and Mark makes a face, and then he exits the elevator with a new bounce. He starts walking down a hallway, and he feels a tissue in his pocket, the one he was crying into. He just tosses it right into the trash can. He walks down hallway after hallway until he gets to his work area, which is one open space with one bunch of desks together. Then we meet Dylan. He notices Petey isn't in yet. He says he better not be out. Irv comes in, also talks about Petey, wondering where he is. Then we're introduced to Mr. Milchek. He comes in, asks for a word with Mark. They go down more hallways, enter Miss Cobell's office as we meet her for the first time, and she says the board will be joining them remotely. Miss Cobell says Petey is no longer with the company. Mark gets promoted and gets offered a handshake. Mark and Irv are next seen in a room that is being used to conduct Helly's orientation. And now we are back into the intro scene, and we see things play out from their perspective. After the initial questions, Mark enters the room to continue the orientation. Helly asks, "Did you grow me as a food? That's why I have no memory." He says no, and he tells her name is Helly R. He explains that she's been hired on the severed floor of Lumen Industries. Helly freaks out, throws a stapler at Mark's head, and tries to escape. Mark calms her down, tells her his name, and said he has gone through the same thing. There's a rule that if someone tries to leave orientation and they ask 3 times, they're allowed to leave. She asked 3 times, then he takes her to a stairwell to leave, but he said he's not allowed to watch. She leaves and instantly returns right back into the office. She does this over and over again until she gives up, walks back to Mark, and says, "Am I dead? Why can't I leave?" He says, "You did leave, but you came back." Miss Cobell welcomes Helly and gives her a video to watch. The video is her, as we come to find out, her Audi. Her Audi is the version of Helly outside of work. We'll get into that in a second. But it's Helly. She explains what severance is, and that from now on, the work version of Helly will no longer be able to access the memories or life of the outside of work Helly. And the outside of work Helly won't know what's going on inside of work. Mark leaves for the day, and his Audi takes over. He walks to his car and finds a note on the windshield. It's a gift card for Pip's Bar and Grill and a letter that says he slipped and fell and sustained a minor blow to his head. He then proceeds to leave the parking lot and almost runs over Audi Helly. They don't recognize each other, of course, and she says, "Maybe keep your eyes on the icy road." He goes home. Next day, calls his neighbor, Miss Selvig, about the trash because she is using his spot for trash and it's becoming an issue. His sister then stops by to pick him up. He forgot there was a dinner that isn't really a dinner. They go back to her house, and her husband, Rickon, answers the door and brings Mark into their house for their not dinner party. We find out Mark used to be a teacher, and so was his late wife. Rickon then tells the party that Mark is severed. His sister jumps in and says it should be Mark's choice to tell people or not, and that Rickon should not have said anything. This spurs up a conversation of what severance is like and whether or not it's moral. Turns out it's a political conversation that is currently going on in this world. So Rickon moves the conversation on. Then when it's just Mark and his sister Devin, the sister says forgetting about her for 8 hours a day isn't the same as healing, talking about Mark's late wife, wondering if that's the reason that he got the procedure. Mark decides to stay over Devin's house. He can't sleep in the middle of the night, and all of a sudden he sees a man in a suit standing out back. He sees them for a few seconds, a car goes by, and then this mysterious figure vanishes. The next day, Mark goes to Pip's Bar and Grill to use his gift card that he got for getting hurt. Miss Selvig calls again to talk about the garbage situation, but then suddenly, the man from last night sits across the table from Mark and says, hang up. He then says, hi kids, what's for dinner? This is what Irving says every time he gets to work. The man says, you won't understand that joke right now, but my name's Petey. I'm from work. Mark says, that's not possible. Petey explains he had his severance procedure reversed, so he is unsevered now, and he can remember both parts of his life. He says that people are after him, specifically Grainer, and that nothing they do down there is what they say. And if something happens to Petey, he wants the things that he knows to stay known, and he prefers to be his friend. Mark says, so we're friends? Petey says, I'm your best friend. You're my very good friend. He gives Mark a card and leaves. Mark opens the car in his car, and Petey explains if he doesn't want to know anything, he won't force it. But if he does, he gave him an address to go to, and it will give him the beginning of a very long answer. Mark then returns home, takes out his trash, and all of a sudden we hear the voice of his neighbor. Then we learn the neighbor, Mrs. Selvig, is actually Miss Cobell to end the first episode. Episode 2 starts off showing Helly's Audi making the video recording that we saw her Innie watch in the first episode. Then Mr. Milchek takes her on a tour of the building, talking of the great Keir Egan, whom we will learn much more about as the season progresses. But we are already getting the idea that Keir is very much a godlike figure to Lumen employees. We then see that Mr. Milchek was actually the one who performed the severance procedure on Helly, one of the many hats that he wears for Lumen. Next scene, we see the sequence play out from Helly's perspective when her Innie kept trying to leave and was greeted by Mr. Milchek each time as he explained to her what was going on. She said, I don't want to be in there, do I? He responded, you'll learn that you do. He then said, when we heard that you were coming, it was like a miracle. It's amazing what you are doing. Mark shows up first to work the next day, as he is now the department chief for micro data refinement, or MDR as they call it. He took over as department chief last episode because Petey left. He is doing his morning routine when the picture of the team with Petey in it throws him off. He gathers the pictures from everyone else's desks and he puts them away in the storage closet. Helly shows up next and her mind is blown that a weekend has gone by, because she can't tell that any time has actually passed at all. Mark tells her to focus on the effects of sleep since they don't get to experience it themselves. Dylan is then explaining the reward system to Helly for finishing files, with the biggest reward of them all being a waffle party for the top MDR rep of the quarter, which Dylan says he's a lock to get this time. Irv notices that the pictures were removed from the desks, and he is not happy about this. Irv is very much a company man, and he likes to follow things by the book, so any bit of change really throws him off. Mark explains that they are taking the new photos today. Then Mark is training Helly on the job, and Irv just can't let it go. He says the photos should have stayed on the desk until the new ones come in, because that's how it's supposed to go. Helly is then getting taught what to do in her job, and she's very confused with the numbers on the screen, and she doesn't even know what they do or why they do it. But for now, Mark is just trying to explain to her that each set of numbers should elicit an emotional response in the refiner. Some numbers can even be scary, but it won't make sense until she sees it herself. Helly asks Mark if she is trapped. If she wants to quit, is that even an option? Mark explains that she could submit a request to her Audi, but they usually don't get approved. He also explains that quitting would effectively end her life, the only one that she knows anyway, since if she never came back to Lumen as a severed employee, this side of her that holds all the gripes would never be awake again. The team are then gathered up by Mr. Milchek as they head over to a team building exercise as part of Helly's ongoing orientation. During this exercise, Helly again shows signs of unhappiness and even wants to record a message back to her Audi. She then learns that the elevators are equipped with code detectors, and any messages they try to sneak to their Audis would be caught. So she can't write a note or anything like that. And it's a very strict policy that they must follow. During the trust exercise, Mark admits that he broke protocol when he got rid of the group photo with Petey. It didn't make him feel comfortable when he saw the picture, so he had to get rid of it. Irv confirms this and he said that he objected to it. Again, company man. Mark then says he's worried that Petey could be dead, and he has no idea where he is or if he's safe. Mr. Milchek then adamantly jumps in and says, hey, death happens outside of Lumen. A life at Lumen protects you from such things because you will never need to know about it. The group then get ready for their group photo. Keeping along with the theme here, Helly is not having it, and she looks very uncomfortable when they are trying to take the photo. She then storms off, says she's not going to work here anymore, writes down I quit on a Post-it note, and storms off towards the elevator. Helly is able to get on the elevator, but that's about it. The elevator doesn't even shut, and alarms start going off. Then Mr. Grainer, who Petey said was after him last episode, goes and takes the note off of Helly and says, perhaps you should come with me. Mark stops them and claims it's his fault because he must have forgotten to go over the data smuggling rules with Helly. And he says this is on him, and he apologizes. Mark then goes down a dark and mysterious hallway to a waiting Miss Cobell. We were then transported to Outie Mark, who was on a date with someone that his sister set him up with. She asks about Lumen, and he confirms that he has no recollection of work. He has no idea what's going on inside there. And she says that really must mess with your head. And he said, I think for some people, that is the whole point, to forget for a little while, to turn off your brain, that you don't have to think about certain things. And you can just shut off, go to work, and that's that. At this point, Mark is still very content with keeping his job because he doesn't want to face getting over his wife, who tragically died in a car accident. Mark and his date are then walking down the block, and they see people protesting Lumen. They cross the street, and they see what's going on. They're handing out pamphlets claiming wrongdoings, including forced labor. Mark takes offense to this, and they get into a big argument. Nice way to end the date, Mark. The next day, Mark was getting ready to go into work, but then he sees the flyer from the protesters from last night. This makes him want to call out sick and head to the address that Petey gave him. Back in the office, Dylan continues telling Helly about the reward system. Then Irv starts spacing out, and we see some black goo that looks like paint start to form all around his work area. Turns out he was just dozing off, which he has done in the past. Mr. Milchek was right there to witness it, and he is not happy. Then we see Mark. He's at the address that Petey gave to him. Finally, he sees Petey. He's there. Then we're back in the office. Mr. Milchek takes Irv to see Miss Casey for a, quote, wellness check to begin his penance for falling asleep on the job again. Helly asks Dylan if he has any idea of what they are actually doing with the numbers. Dylan comes up with a wild theory that says they are populating the sea with probes. It's a wild theory that doesn't make much sense, but then he says that Irv thinks they are just cutting swear words out of movies. So they really have no idea what's going on. And in a perfect transition, this is exactly what Petey and Mark are talking about at the same time. Petey says, even though he's had his severance procedure reversed, he still doesn't know what they were actually doing with the numbers. But he did tell Mark he began a project mapping out the entire area of the severed access floor, everything that he can remember and exactly what spot they are in. He tells Mark that he hid the original map for him when he left so that Mark can find it. They think that if they can map the floor completely, that things will start to make more sense. Petey then gets a ringing headache in what he calls reintegration sickness. He tells Mark he can't even go home because people are after him, so he's been living out in the cold in a greenhouse. Petey then tells Mark about the break room. This is where Mark's Annie was the day before when he took the fall for Helly. This is the place they get sent off when they don't act right. Petey plays a recording of Mark's Annie repeating the same sentence over and over again to apologize for his actions. We now know that the break room is essentially a place for innies to be tortured during work. Back to Irv. While waiting for his wellness check, he meets Christopher Walken's Bert from Optics and Design. This is the first character that we met that doesn't work for MDR. Then we meet Miss Casey, who is running the wellness check. She starts it off by sharing some facts about Irv's Audi, which is meant to be pleasing, but the facts are not to be shared outside the room. She says some things like, your Audi is generous. Your Audi is fond of music and owns many records. Your Audi is a friend to children and to the elderly and to the insane. Irv begins to laugh. Miss Casey stops him and says, please enjoy each fact equally. She then takes 10 points off and says he has 90 points remaining. This confuses Irv. He speaks again. She says, you can't speak any further or all remaining points will be deducted and the wellness session will end. Helly bugs Dylan about the scanners, trying to find a loophole so she can get a message to her outie. She wants to know if she can write it on her body, if she can use different symbols, any way around getting a message to her outie. But then it happens. She's looking at her numbers and she starts to see it. She points at the screen and says, that. Dylan says, you'll be okay. Just fence off the bad data like I told you. She refines the file, says, wow, that was scary. The numbers are scary. Then we see Mark has taken Petey back to his house. He's letting him stay in his basement since he doesn't want him staying in the greenhouse anymore. Petey is already in bad shape, so Mark just feels bad letting him stay out there. So he opens his home to him. Petey then goes into the bathroom and he's going through a lot of pain. His nose starts bleeding profusely and he's not doing well. He jumps in the shower, the ringing headache comes back, and it continues to get worse. He slumps down to a seat in the shower, sitting down, and the episode ends with Mark asking, Petey, are you okay? Episode 3 picks up with Petey at Mark's house. He's still having a hard time. He's going through reintegration sickness, and he tells Mark that it's basically two lives that are suddenly stitched together. And he's having all these flashbacks and memories, and things are really hard to figure out what's real and what's not right now in his mind. And Mark actually says, well, it's not a blight to me. It's helped me. And, because he lost his wife and he doesn't have to think about it for 8 hours. So then Petey says to him, what if the cost of that is that you help murder people for 8 hours a day and you don't even know it? Mark says, is that happening? Petey can't say for sure what's actually going on down there, but he does say that he found a department, one where you can't leave. And Mark gets confused by this, and he says, what do you mean by that? And Petey says, as in they're down there right now. Petey then has a moment where he forgets where he is, and he says, where the fuck is June? And this kind of makes him sit back, and Mark asks, who's June? And he says, June is his daughter. Right around this time, we see Miss Cobell spying on Mark. Mark's now in his living room watching TV, and a woman named Natalie is defending Lumen. We're going to meet her later on this episode. Mark then wakes up on the couch, tells Petey he's going to go back into work, and he's not going to reintegrate because Severance actually is helping him. Petey then mentions to him when he was down there, he knew something was going on. And he said, you carry the hurt with you. You feel it down there too. You just don't know what it is. Just because he's not thinking about it doesn't mean it's not affecting him still down there. And that might not be the best case to deal with things. Back at work, Helly tells Mark that she deleted the scary numbers, and she seems pretty excited about this. But then, just a minute later, she tells Mark that she submitted her resignation request. Right after this, Mark starts reading the morning announcements, the first time that he's the chief of the department, so he has to do this every morning. Right when he begins to do this, Mr. Milchek starts taking pictures of him. But suddenly, Mark stops reading when he sees the resignation request was already answered. That fast of a turnaround doesn't usually happen for resignation requests. And he reads that it was denied by Helly's outie. If you want to leave Lumen, you submit a resignation request to yourself that your outie must approve. In this case, her outie denied it, and she's right back in the same situation that she was at before. Then Rickon drops a copy of his book off at Mark's. We see Miss Cobell lurking, and she goes over to see what it is. She picks it up, but then we see that she has a key for Mark's house. She goes in, Petey freaks out, so he hides. She goes downstairs, he sneaks upstairs, sneaks outside, but she's basically just looking all around, trying to see if Mark's up to anything. But then she ultimately takes the book into Lumen with her. So Helly has been in the bathroom for a while since she found out that her request was denied. So Mark goes in to check on her because he's worried about her. She was in there writing a note on her body. Mark says, I'll give you 5 minutes to scrub your arms. And she says, why would I do that? And Mark's answer to that is, do you want Grainer to use the bad soap? Helly says, there's bad soap? Irving brings up to Mark that she should see the perpetuity wing if there's deeper meaning that she craves. Miss Cobell comes into work and gives the book Mr. Milchek and tells him to check it for messages. Meanwhile, Helly still is thinking of ways to get a message to her outie. She writes a note on a Post-it, folds it up, puts it in the cap of a Sharpie, tapes the Sharpie cap, and plans to swallow it whole. Right before she has a chance to do this, though, Mark walks in and says that the code detectors can read messages on the inside of the body as well. And if that happens, it's Mr. Milchick's job to get the note out of her. This stops her from swallowing the message, and she spits it out and gives it to Mark. Right after this, Mark tells her that they're going on a trip and to close up her workstation. Then Natalie from the TV earlier, she's in Miss Cobell's office, and she's there to talk about Petey. And she says that the board is joining them in this conversation. Miss Cobell tells the board that there's signs of possible reintegration for Petey. They get really upset by this, and they say it's not possible and that someone in your position should know that's not possible. Miss Cobell says, I know, but it really seems like he might have done this. The meeting ends, and they're not happy with Miss Cobell at all. The team arrived to the Perpetuity Wing, and there's a statue of Jane Egan right when they walk in. He's the current CEO of Lumen. The whole time in this wing, Irving is in all of his glory. He loves everything about the history of Lumen, and he starts spouting off information left and right. He tells the story of the first female CEO, and then Helly jumps in and says, it almost makes me want to remember my own childhood. We find out that Lumen has been around since 1866, and they go in the back room where a perfect replica of Kira Egan's house has been built. They go inside, and in Irving's words, it's just as he might have left it. While they're checking out the house, Helly takes off to escape again. Mr. Milchick doesn't hear all the noise because he's reading Rickon's book, as Miss Cobell just told him to do. Helly breaks the glass to the door that would lead out of the severed access floor. She holds a note out that says, never come back here, but she doesn't make it far enough when Mark stops her and pulls her in. Mr. Grainer then finds her and takes her to the break room as Mr. Milchick is in there waiting for her. She begins to read a prepared statement to apologize, and Mr. Milchick says, I'm afraid you don't mean it. Say it again. She does this over and over and over. Then Petey is at a gas station and he begins bleeding from the nose and he collapses in pain. Mark arrives home and finds that Petey's gone. He goes out looking for him. While he's searching for Petey, he sees an ambulance. So he decides to follow this ambulance all the way to a gas station where he sees Petey being helped out of the store. He's in bad shape. He locks eyes with Mark and he collapses again. And this time he's not breathing. Mark leaves and he hurries back to his basement to cover up any evidence that Petey was ever there. Right when he finishes and he heads back upstairs, he hears a cell phone vibrating, which must be Petey's. Episode 4 picks up with Helly still in the break room with Mr. Milchick. He says to her, I'm afraid you still don't mean it. We'll try again in the morning. So she spent the remainder of that day in the break room. We see her leave for the day. She's disheveled. She's tired. She's out of it. They head over to the elevator. She goes in the elevator. It shuts and opens up right away to the next day. So it's instantly for her any that she's back in the same situation. They go right back to the break room. And she says to Mr. Milchick, I read it 300 times yesterday. He says 259. Again, please. Now, right before she's about to start up again, she hears a voice. And she says, what the hell is that voice? Mr. Milchick ignores her. She continues, breaks down. She really apologizes, but he just says, do it again. Back at Mark's house, he picks up the cell phone that was on the floor that we saw last week, and all recent incoming calls are from a blocked number. Then back at work, Mark's innie found the map that Petey had left for him, that Petey had hoped that he would find it. Then Bert from Optics and Design stops by. He brings in the new handbook totes, and Irv is very excited about this. Dylan is being rude and tells him to drop off the tote bags and bounce. Before leaving, Bert leaves directions to Optics and Design, O&D as they call it, for them to stop by whenever they want. Irv immediately gathers his things and heads over to O&D. He said to Mark, it's absurd we never visited them before. It was Kier's vision for all of us to be working together. Dylan comments on the rumor that O&D has massacred a department before, and that's why they keep them separated, so he doesn't trust them. Helly shows up back to their space. Mark says, how many times? She apologized 1,072 times. Helly asks, what about the voice behind the door? Dylan said, you mean the crying baby? So they both heard different things. And Mark pops in and says, you're not supposed to talk about it, so they stop. Irving then shows up to O&D to visit Bert. Bert shows him around. They talk, they get along, and eventually their hands touch, and they decide to hold hands for a second. This freaks Irving out, and he leaves. On his way back, he spots Rickon's book. Then Helly finds the map, and she shows Dylan. He's surprised that he didn't turn it in. Helly then says to Mark, your best friend left this for you and you don't give a shit? He says, you're right, I don't give a shit, and he shreds it. Irv then shows up to show the team the book. They weigh on what to do about it, and then Mark opens the book and he sees there's a message to Mark. He says he'll turn it in to Milchek. Helly then sneakily grabs a paper cutter and she walks into Miss Cobell's office and she threatens to cut her fingers off if Miss Cobell doesn't give her a camera so she can film her resignation. Cobell tells Milchek to grab one and she films the message. She then gets walked to the elevator, gets on, tells Mr. Milchek that she was never sorry, and then the elevator shuts, opens right back up, and she has a DVD in her hand. She plays the DVD, and it turns out that her Audi is very adamant that she will not let her resign. She even scolds the innie Helly for threatening to cut off her fingers. She says, "If you ever do anything to my fingers, know that I will keep you alive long enough to regret that." And then she says, "Your request is denied." Mark is at home now, and he gets an alert that Petey has died. Right after this, he hears that phone vibrate again. Grainer goes to Cobell's office and asks if she heard from the board yet. He claims that Petey is neither of their faults. Cobell tells Grainer that they need to get his chip, and Grainer reminds her that he's going to be incinerated after the funeral. Then we see Mark is at the funeral, and Mrs. Selvig, aka Miss Cobell, shows up, and they are both surprised to see each other. She walks up to Petey's daughter at the funeral, and Mark goes to grab a drink. Mark then meets Nina, Petey's ex-wife, who asks, "You're from Lumen? So you didn't even know him at all?" He then meets June. Him and June get to talking, and June asks, "So you knew him from work?" And he says, "Yeah." So she goes, "Oh, so you're one of those." And she calls him out for doing Severance. She says that's not the way that people are supposed to deal with their problems. A video is then playing of June and Petey playing music together. Then Miss Cobell sneaks off to the body. She cuts the chip out of Mark's head with a drill. After the funeral, Mark drives to the site where his wife died in a car accident. Back at the office, Cobell gives Milchek Petey's chip and asks him to bring it to diagnostics to check it out. Miss Casey then shows up, and she asks Miss Casey to run a special wellness session with Mark. Says he needs it. Irv then runs into Bert. Bert says he's sorry and he embarrassed himself. Irv assures him that he didn't, and he asks if he wants to go for a walk. He agrees. Mark is then in the bathroom stall reading Ricken's book, and he seems to find it profound, while his Audi could care less about it. Helly tells Dylan that she is leaving for the day, and we see that she has an extension cord in her hand as she leaves. She then picks up a trash can on her walk. We cut to Dylan. He finds that Mark has stashed the book. Cut to Mark in the wellness session. Cut to Coble. He's watching them in the wellness section. Back to the session. He's supposed to sculpt what he's feeling out of clay. Helly then calls for the elevator as Dylan is reading the book. Irv is at O&D. Mark is sculpting. The elevator then appears, and Helly sets up for a suicide attempt. Irv finds a passage in O&D leading to a huge space with a lot more people, so it turns out there's more than just two people in this department. Helly then puts the rope around her neck, and we see what Mark has been working on in the wellness session. He built a tree, just like the tree that his wife died at. Then we cut to Helly. She has the noose around her neck, kicks the trash can, and then Helly drops as the episode ends. Episode 5 opens up with Helly hanging in the elevator as she was trying her suicide attempt. Mark finds her in the elevator as he leaves for the day. Right then, Mr. Grainer shows up, and he pulls her down, and he tells Mark to get in the elevator and leave. While he's leaving, Helly's body is lifeless on the ground, so he doesn't know if she's alive or not. Mark then arrives for work the next day, and Miss Cobell and Mr. Milchek are waiting. They say that Helly is in the hospital. She has no permanent damage, but her Audi still has no wish to resign. Mark then grabs Ricken's book, as he often does lately, and he reads more in the bathroom. He continues to read this book whenever he has a chance because it's really the only literature that he's ever had as an innie. Mr. Grainer comes back with the results from Petey's chip, and he confirms that he was, in fact, reintegrated. So Miss Cobell was right. Mark then attends a birthing retreat with his sister Devin and Ricken. Ricken is upset that Mark hasn't thanked him for the book yet. Mark said he hasn't even seen it because his innie has it and his Audi doesn't know anything about it. They think it's stolen. Ricken then says it actually could be a good thing. If the thief reads it, I bet you he turns his life around and turns himself in afterwards. Devin then meets a woman that's in a neighboring lodge at the birthing community. She's very rich, quiet, and nice. That's what Devin says about her. We'll find out more about this person later on. Mark tells Devin he thinks Lumen might be up to something. He's been hearing stuff. He begins to tell her about Petey and everything that was going on with him, but then she starts to have contractions. Back in the office, Mr. Milchick briefs Mark on how to treat Helly when she comes back. When her innie awakens, she's on the floor of the elevator because in her mind, she had just attempted suicide and then woke right back up on the floor of the elevator. Miss Casey shows up to observe Helly R. She is to look out for signs of sadness and to verbally encourage her from any further suicide attempts. Irv starts to doze off again, as he has been doing frequently lately, and then he says he has to go to O&D because he needs to talk to Bert. Mr. Milchick accidentally printed out pictures that showed a massacre between O&D and different departments. Turns out this was his plan. As Mr. Milchick and Cobell talk about this, the whole point was to dissuade Irv from spending so much time with Bert. So they're trying to scare other departments from hanging out. Cobell then tells Milchick she is trying something new with Miss Casey and to keep it between them. Mark shows Helly he's been working on a new map since he shredded the other one. Helly says, "I'm not your new Petey," and walks away. Irv goes to find Bert in the conference room, but Dylan interrupts this because he's scared of the propaganda that Mr. Milchick had printed out earlier. He explains to Bert that O&D are told rumors about MDR, just like MDR told rumors about O&D. So they're starting to piece it together that this is, in fact, propaganda. Helly and Mark follow the noise that they hear. Then they see a baby goat. And then they walk further. They walk into a room, and it's one man caring for all these baby goats. He screams, "They're not ready. You can't take them yet. They're not ready. It isn't time. You guys gotta leave." So that was strange. Irv and Bert then talk about how relationships beyond platonic are strictly forbidden. He invites Irv and Dylan to the storage room to check out new art. Dylan then finds the painting of MDR killing O&D employees. So now he's starting to see that it's propaganda. Back to Helly and Mark. She changed her mind and she said she will help Mark with his new map. Bert then introduced Irv and Dylan to the rest of O&D, which had been hidden before. So O&D and MDR are starting to really trust each other more as the episode ends. Episode 6 opens up with Miss Cobell getting a call from Mr. Grainer. He claims that Ragabi, a former employee of Lumen, was the one who cracked reintegration and that he will find her. She then kneels to her shrine of her late husband. We don't know much about him yet, but this could come into play later on. Mark is at home and goes through Petey's cell phone before hopping in his car to head to work. Then he stops, puts his car in reverse, takes apart the battery of the phone, and tosses it into the trash can before he heads to work. Irv and Bert are spending more time together. This time, it's a room full of plants that Bert wanted to show Irv. He says this can be just for us, our secret place. They hold hands again, and Bert says the Lumen manual doesn't discourage lip-to-lip contact. Irv just isn't ready yet, and he apologizes to Bert. Devin then takes her newborn baby to a park at the birthing retreat place, and she runs into the woman from last week, the one she had coffee with. This woman does not recognize her at all. She reminds her that they had coffee together, and the woman plays it off like she does remember, even though she doesn't. Then her husband shows up. It's very awkward, and the husband pulls her away from the conversation, leaving Devin very confused. Mark's innie continues reading Rickon's book, his favorite new hobby, and then Bert says the group should head over to O&D immediately. Dylan, of course, is against this again, but they all ponder what O&D actually does. But Irv is against Mark and Helly's plan to map out the floor. Then Dylan senses a flirtatious relationship between Mark and Helly, and Mark denies this. Then Mr. Milchick shows up, and the group says that they were talking about Miss Casey, wondering where she is. Mark is then with Miss Cobell, and she tells him that Miss Casey is no longer with them because she failed at her task to keep Helly in line because Mark took her for a walk last episode. Mark then gets a little impatient. He asks Miss Cobell what it is they actually do here. He really wants some answers here. Cobell then screams at him, "We serve Kier." And then she says, the hallway privileges are now revoked for MDR. Dylan then questions Helly about her relationship with Mark. She denies having any feelings. Then Mark breaks the news that they can't roam the hallway anymore until they hit the quota. Irv steps up and takes the blame because he's always trying to go off to see Bert. But then Mark asks Irv how to get to O&D, and the whole team take off, breaking the rule immediately. Cobell sees this on her security cam, and she sends Milchek after them. Bert shows the whole team all the employees that O&D have, and they are all shocked about how many people are actually there. Bert introduces all of MDR to O&D and says they are all welcome here from here on out. The two teams ask each other about their work, but neither really know what they are doing. They just have random guesses. And Mark tells Bert they found a department that are raising baby goats. Mark says the two departments should work together to find out what is actually going on and how big the place is and how many employees are actually on the severed floor. Mark then speaks out against Lumen. Again, he's getting very impatient. He says, why don't they tell us what we are doing here? What are they so afraid of? Bert agrees, saying Keir would want them all to be true partners. He says they should contact the GOAT department to see what they know to find out more about what is actually going on. While they were in this room, Dylan picks up a card that was in O&D as Milchek walks in. He stuffs it into his back pocket as they are all sent back to MDR. At MDR, Cobell is waiting for them. She tells Mark she trusted him and he betrayed that trust. Then he is sent to the break room by Grainer. As he is going into the break room, Miss Casey is coming out. Mark tells her he is sorry as he feels responsible that she was in the break room in the first place. Mark's Audi is now at dinner with Devin's friend Alexa as they try again since the first date didn't go too well. Devin is then doing research on the woman that didn't recognize her in the park. Turns out her name is Gabriella, and she is married to a senator who is very pro-Severance. So now Devin's trying to figure out what's really going on. Then Devin and Rickon are looking for a babysitter. Who shows up? Miss Selvig, a.k.a. Cobell. She's the one interviewing for the job to take care of Rickon and Devin's kid. So she's trying to get even more close to Mark and his family. What is she up to here? Turns out she's really good with the baby, and she impresses Rickon and Devin. Then Dylan's innie is woken up at his house by Milchek. He wants the card back that Dylan stole from O&D. Dylan tells Milchek he didn't take it home. He hid it in the bathroom at work. Then Dylan's son walks in, and this blows his mind. Again, Dylan's innie had no idea of his Audi's life, so he realizes he has a son, and this causes Milchek to panic. He tells someone to turn it off, so then Dylan's Audi wakes up again. So now that we learn Severance can be activated anywhere, you don't have to just be at the severed access floor. That's a big revelation. Then Mark and Alexa are walking down the street, continuing their date, and Mark sees a poster for June's band, PD's daughter, and it turns out they're playing a show right now. He asks Alexa if they can go, and they go check it out. It's a punk rock band, and they're singing a song that is basically "Fuck you, Lumen, fuck you, Lumen." Mark joins in on this chant as his innie and his Audi are really starting to rebel from Lumen. He talks to June after the show to see how she is holding up, but then a fight breaks out, so they leave. Mark then explains to Alexa that June is the daughter of Petey, who died. As he explains this to Alexa, she kisses him. Then Mr. Grainer shows up at Miss Selvig's house. He says that he found some info on Ragabi. He found where she is operating out of, and he plans to go over there. Cobell says, let me know what you find out. Then Mark goes back into the trash can looking for Petey's cell phone that he tossed earlier. He puts it back together and immediately receives a phone call. He answers. It's Ragabi. She knows it's Mark. She says, what did he tell you before he died? Mark says, nothing. He just wants to understand. She tells Mark to come meet her right now. He goes to the location and Ragabi asks if Mark is alone. Turns out she's at the school that Mark used to teach at. She then says, come with me, as the episode ends. Episode 7 is called Defiant Jazz, and it is my favorite episode of this season. It starts off with Mark and Ragabi at the school that Mark used to work at. Mark asks Ragabi, who are you? She replies, come with me. They walk down a bunch of hallways and end up in a basement area of the school, and this is the area that she's been working out of. Ragabi says to Mark that he could have thrown Petey's phone out weeks ago. Why didn't you? Mark asks again, who are you? She replies, I'm the one that helped your friend. Mark replies, you didn't help him. You killed him. When you did the severance procedure, it ultimately killed him. Ragabi then defends her actions by saying that the procedure didn't kill Petey at all, and that if he followed the post-op instructions like she said and not simply run away at the first sign of sickness, he would have been okay if he stuck with her. She then tells Mark that she's the one that put the chip in his head, and she's still the only one that can deactivate it. Mark says, maybe I don't want it taken out. She says, maybe your innie does. Then she goes on to say that she actually hates the word innie and finds it offensive. Mark says that his innie lives his own life, and as a result, he gets to live his. Ragabi says maybe he loves it, but maybe he doesn't. Mark wouldn't know, and he'll never know. Mark then says that he's not a bad person, but right then, Mr. Grainer shows up. He says, Mr. Scout? Mark says, do I know you? Mr. Grainer says, I work with you down there. He asks Mark who he's talking to. He says, it's okay. I'm her friend. Ragabi then comes from behind him and beats him to death with a baseball bat. Don't think they were friends. She gives Mark his security card, claiming it has full access and cannot be tracked by anyone, and that his innie will know what to do with it. She says it will be okay, she will be in touch, and they will finish what Petey started. Mark arrives home and takes off everything he was wearing and tosses it into a trash bag. As he's doing this, Alexa wakes up and walks out into the hall. I don't think that he remembered that she was even there. She said that he's being weird. She's been up for an hour and he wasn't there. He said that he needed to drive a little. She asked him if she wants her to leave. He says maybe. She leaves. Mark takes Mr. Grainer's key card before walking out the door to head to work. He takes his clothes that were in the trash bag from last night and tosses them into the trash bin. Mrs. Selvig, or Miss Cobell, notices this and says that he usually does that later in the day. She, of course, knows something is going on, and she's starting to sense more and more that Mark is involved. Mr. Milchek installed a door that would lock MDR employees in their office for the duration of their shifts. He then goes into the bathroom stall to find that card that Dylan stole. Milchek delivers the card back to Bert and tells him that he's a great leader and he deserves something special. Bert is hoping it's not another trip back to the break room since he just went yesterday. Milchek says it's something else. Stay tuned. Dylan shows up and asks what the hell was that to Mr. Milchek. Milchek tells him it was the overtime contingency and it's for emergency use only. Dylan asks if that was his son. Milchek says yes, but he shouldn't tell anyone and he shouldn't learn the son's name as that would make things harder. Dylan seemingly agrees, but he's more in shock of what he's just seen. Remember, to Dylan's innie, this just happened. Milchek then greets Mark at the elevator, and he says there's a new protocol, and he needs to escort Mark to his desk. When they get there, Mark says, what, are we locked in now? Milchek says he prefers the term safely situated. Howie asks Mark what's going on with the doors being locked like that. Mark kind of ignores it to check in on Irv and Dylan. Dylan is clearly still in shock and is kind of quiet. Milchek calls Cobell to say Grainer hasn't come in yet, and everything is fine. It's just he's wondering where she is. She's at Mark's house, continuing her pursuit to be the baby's full-time caretaker. She stays later to talk to Devin, trying to find out more information about Mark. Devin brings up the senator's wife and how she didn't remember her. She is thinking that Lumen is severing people outside of work and that it is something bigger than what they are leading on. She thinks this woman has been severed to carry out the term of the pregnancy. Cobell then asks why Mark did it. Devin says it was about losing his wife. She then asked Devin if he ever talks about her. She said when her husband passed, she thought she saw him everywhere. She then asked Devin if Mark ever thinks he sees her. Back at MDR, Dylan continues to lose it little by little, while Irv bugs Mark about soap not being labeled. Mark says, what are you talking about? And then Irv says, oh, that sounds like an O&D question, actually. I should go and see Bert. Both Mark and Dylan tell him that he can't leave right now. Then Milchek walks in with an MDE because Helly got to the 75% mark on her project. An MDE is a musical dance experience. Milchek explains that she must choose one genre and one accessory. She chooses the maraca and defiant jazz, the episode title, as her genre. Milchek urges all refiners to take advantage of the opportunity presented. The music starts and Milchek turns on mood lights as they all start to dance outside of Dylan. Milchek then perhaps has the best dance scene in all of TV history, and they are all actually enjoying themselves. But the camera keeps going back to Dylan, showing him growing more and more uncomfortable. Then Mark digs into his pocket and he finds Mr. Grainer's key card. He quickly puts it back in as the dancing continues. Milchek dances with every single refiner on MDR, and then he makes his way over to Dylan. He tries to get Dylan to dance, but Dylan snaps. He stands up and shoves Milchek into the record player and bites him when he's on the ground. Milchek says that he broke the skin, and he's reporting this to Miss Cobell. Dylan says, yeah, you want to see her together? implying about Milchek using the overtime contingency last night. Milchek then storms out. Then Dylan tells everyone about the overtime contingency, and he says he woke up in his house last night with Milchek and saw his son, who hugged him. He says Milchek quickly pulled him off, and it was over. It happened so fast. He then says, now I'm supposed to just have that in my head now and never see him again? Helly says that they can use the overtime contingency for themselves. Irv says it's surely somewhere they can't access, but then Mark pulls out Grainer's key card. Helly asks why his Audi has the key card to the head of security. He has no idea, but they all decide it's time for a field trip, and Helly wonders if there are any security guards outside of Grainer that even work there. Mark says Petey once showed him where the security office is, and they can actually do this. Once they get to the hall, Irv runs off and says he has to make sure that Bert is okay. Helly and Mark continue on while Dylan stays back at MDR. They find the office, go inside, they wander around a little bit until Helly finds a board of names, and they find all of MDR listed. She then opens up a job manual looking for directions on the overtime contingency. But as she's doing that, Mark sees that Cobell is now in the elevator heading down towards the severed access floor. Helly finds the info that she needs in the manual, rips it out, and they head back to MDR before Cobell can see. But Natalie stopped Cobell before she could even get there, and she says she has the board on the phone that they need to talk right now because Grainer is dead. Cobell says whoever killed Grainer is probably whoever reintegrated Petey. The board again says it's impossible, but Cobell assures them it is, and she even says that she has proof in Petey's chip. She wants to meet them in person and talk it over. They agree that they will hear her out at the Egan family gala next week in person. Irving makes his way to O&D, and he finds that they are throwing Bert a retirement party. Back at MDR, Dylan is surprised to find out no one was in the security office. Helly reads the instructions to the overtime contingency in the manual, and they find out that they can definitely do it and wake themselves up on the outside world. Dylan offers to be the one to wake everyone up and stay back since he already woke up once outside so that they all can experience it. Irving is just watching Bert's party as Milchek gives a speech, and he notices that Irving is there. He says he needs to look at their new doors. He plays a video from Bert's Audi recording a message to his innie saying thanks to his coworkers and to his innie. He ends the message by saying, though he is unaware of it at a conscious level, he will never forget them. He thanks them all again, and he says, good job, buddy, to his innie. Irv then loses it on Milchek for not being severed, and he says he doesn't understand what it's like to be in their position. Milchek demands he goes back to MDR, but Bert asks him to stay. Milchek allows it, but he's clearly upset with Irving. Milchek then plays Bert's any retirement song selection as Bert shakes hands with all of O&D, and then comes Irv. Milchek notices them shaking hands and sees the look they give each other. Irv leaves very upset. MDR sees him walk back in upset, and Mark checks in on him. Irving says, let's burn this place to the ground. They all shake their heads and agree. Mark is now back at home, drinking heavily. Alexa then shows back up to get her phone. He gives it back to her. She notices that he is hammered, so she asks if he's okay. She then goes to leave, and he tries to stop her. He apologizes for the night before. Then he says, you don't think I'm over my wife? So he pulls out a picture of her, and he rips it up. He tries to get that to prove that he's over her. Alexa doesn't like that at all, and she tries to leave again. Mark follows her outside, says they should talk about it, but Alexa just gets in her car and says, goodbye, Mark. Mark goes back inside, and he picks up the pieces of the photo. He puts them on the table and decides to tape it back together. As he's taping it back together, her face is obstructed the whole time until finally he removes his finger. His wife is Miss Casey. What a way to end an episode. This week, things start off with Irving sitting down on a bench and his dog is beside him. His Audi is just enjoying the day. Then he takes his dog back to the apartment and we see some of Irving's routine for the first time, which does not include sleeping. This could be why his innie falls asleep so often. He makes himself a coffee, then he starts to paint. He painted the hallway leading to the break room. This shows us that some of the memories are starting to merge together between his innie and his Audi. He starts to paint something new while blasting rock music, and it just seems like he's really painting the same hallway over and over and over again. So Irving's Audi, since he's not sleeping much, he spends his time thinking, and his thoughts start to merge together. Then we see all of the refiners return to work, and they all have the same kind of sour look on their face. They all know that they can wake up with the overtime contingency, but that's all they can think about lately. It's taking up all the space in their heads. So we see them all get to work with their numbers, trying hard for everyone to finish their files. Helly's the last one, and Dylan is concerned she won't finish, since him and Irv finished a week ago. Irv thinks they should stand behind her and chant her name, But Mark says she'll make it. Just let her focus. The refiners aren't the only people that are monitoring her progress because Cobell and Milchek also are. It is very important for her to have a good quarter because things have been rough for Lumen lately. Cobell also wants to schedule one last wellness session for Mark before the quarter ends. Milchek shows concern about that decision, but Cobell says she imagines Kier would be very satisfied with the work that Milchek has done, encouraging him to just believe in her and have her back about this decision. Then Helly completes her file. The team congratulate her, and Irv says, so it's on now. Their plan of waking themselves up using the overtime contingency has come into play, and we'll find out more about that very soon. After completion, Mark is called into Cobell's office. She asks him who he wants to have the waffle party. He says Dylan. We, as an audience, know that they want Dylan to have the waffle party because he's the one who volunteered to stay back and wake the others up outside. But Cobell's pretty surprised to hear this. She thought that Mark would just pick himself, but she goes along with what Mark wants, and she says, okay, Dylan can get the waffle party. And she thanks Mark for the hard work, saying Lumen needed this. Mark shows up for his wellness session, and he's greeted by Miss Casey, whom we found out last episode is actually Mark's wife, who he thinks is dead. He asks why everything in her office is in boxes, and she tells him that she's retiring at the conclusion of this session. She says she just found out a moment ago. During the session, she tells Mark he successfully led his department to complete their task, which is why he was rewarded the wellness session. Miss Casey goes on to say that Mark's outie is kind. He brightens people's days merely by smiling. He makes time for people. But then Mark interrupts her and he says, let me talk to somebody. He thinks he can maybe save her job. She then breaks character as Miss Casey and starts to talk as a person. She tells Mark that she really enjoyed being in MDR's office that day. She says she knows that she's strange, but Mark cuts her off and says, you're not strange. But then we find out her life has only been 107 hours long. Most of that 107 hours has been split up between half-hour sessions. So she's typically only awake for 30 minutes at a time, and then who knows what happens to her. This being the case, her favorite memory was spending 8 hours at MDR monitoring Helly. It was the longest she'd ever been awake and calls it her good old days. Mark shows concern for this, and Miss Casey wonders why Mark even cares what happens to her. But then we see Miss Cobell has been and is watching their session. Mark then answers Miss Casey's question, saying, because this is our lives. No one gets to just turn you off. She calls Mark nice, and she seems to really like what he's saying to her right now. Cobell kind of gasps. She's taken back by this, wondering if they are starting to recognize each other. But then Miss Casey just continues with the wellness session. Milchek says, it's a good thing that they don't remember each other, right? It means the chips work. It's a win. Then we see Milchek is escorting Miss Casey to a hallway leading to an area I presume to be the area on the map that PD marked off as people live here, because she just walks down a random dark hallway and gets into an elevator. And if most of her life is in half-hour sessions, she probably is just going to be stored somewhere. But what do you guys think is going on with Miss Casey? Let me know in the comments. Mark tells the group that Miss Casey has been fired, and they all wonder if there's anything they can do. But then Milchek walks in and says Dylan's waffle party will commence at the end of their shift. And in the meantime, he has a pre-waffle party egg bar social for everyone to enjoy. But before they begin, Dylan is handed a gift from Mr. Milchek. They all wonder what the prize is, so he opens it up, but we as the audience do not see what this gift is at this point in time. We only see their reactions as they all surround him and thank him. The egg bar social begins. Dylan tells Helly the egg bar is coveted as fuck as Milchek continues to take photos of MDR as he's done the whole season. Helly says to Dylan that she should be the one to stay back, but Dylan says no, and that what they are doing tonight is just the first step. He assures her he wants to be the one to stay. Then we see Natalie shows up to Miss Cobell's office, and she has pictures of Helly's suicide attempt. She says, how could you not tell us? Cobell wonders if Milchek ratted her out, but all that Natalie and the board care about is why she would hold back Helly's suicide attempt from them. She also calls Miss Cobell out for spending so much time with Devin, Mark's sister. They tell her she is fired and she has to leave immediately. She says, fuck that, is the board even there? And for the first time all season, they speak, saying yes. She apologizes, takes down her aggressiveness, and says she can explain everything tonight at the Egan's annual party. They all say it's too late. They made their decision. She's fired. Back at MDR, Helly asks Mark if he is scared about tonight. Helly tries to calm Mark by saying that they won't see anything coming. But then Mark says, or we won't wake up, meaning that their innies are in danger of never waking up again because they know too much. If they're caught in action, there's a good chance that their innies will never wake up again. Mark is scared he will wake up and realize he has too many things to care about, giving him something to lose. This kind of mirrors his outie in the reason that he took the job in the first place. Helly and Mark share a nice moment together, letting them know that they both care about each other. Then Milchek comes in and says there has been a problem, which is Miss Cobell getting fired, and that the egg bar social is over. So everyone needs to leave except Dylan, who is going to get his waffle party. Milchek says he'll be right back, and then he goes to escort Miss Cobell to the elevator, and he asks for her key card. Pretty cold, Milchek. Then Mark and Helly talk to Dylan one last time to make sure he has everything he needs to complete the plan. Mark tells them all to be ready for anything as they go up the elevator, since they will immediately wake up outside to their perspective. Mark admits that he had kept Rickon's book, and he reads a section from the book to pump everyone up. But while he's reading it, Dylan completes the line, showing that he knew where it was, as we saw in an earlier episode, and he was reading it and putting it back little by little. So it's a nice bonding moment before they start this mission. Irv then gets in the elevator and says, "Okay, kids, let's find out what's for dinner." And Irv is gone. Now it's just Helly and Mark talking by the elevator, waiting to leave. Helly wonders if they will meet their spouses, or that maybe they're married to each other. She gets in the elevator, but before the doors close, she stops it and runs out to kiss Mark. She says, "In case we don't come back," or I don't know, in case we do. She then says, "Good luck out there, boss," and leaves. Mark then takes one last look around the office before getting on the elevator. Dylan is reading the instructions of the overtime contingency over and over again, trying to memorize it as much as he can. He's in the bathroom stall when Milchek walks in. He then gets out and heads to the waffle party. Milchek then walks Dylan to the perpetuity wing and goes all the way to the back to Keir Egan's replica house. Dylan is now by himself, and he walks inside to see 3 waffles set on a table. He takes a seat, pours syrup on the waffles, and starts to eat. Then we see Cobell in her car cursing Lumen for firing her on her way home, especially Natalie. She's not a fan of her at the moment. She's really torn up about this because Lumen was her life. Flashback to Dylan. He finishes his waffles, and there's a message on the plate that he was eating off of. It says, "Go to Keir's bed." He goes to the bed and then puts a mask of Keir on before laying down. Then, lying on the bed with his mask on, female dancers come on with a various assortment of outfits and masks, including someone dressed up as a bride. And then they all do some sort of dance that looks and feels ritualistic. While the scene is happening, they transition back and forth to Dylan and to Miss Cobell, who is tearing her house apart. She breaks things, she rips things off the wall, and then she destroys what looks to be a shrine of her late husband. Dylan leaves Keir's house and heads to the security room, and no one's watching over him at the time, so he's all on his own. Mark shows up to Mrs. Selvig, aka Cobell's house, and says, "Hey, sorry to just pop over, but I'm heading to Devin and Rickon's, and I was told to double check to see if you're coming." She says, "Sorry, I'm not. I'm just not feeling myself this evening, Mark." Then, before he leaves, she has the change of heart saying, "Maybe I can drive my own car. That way I can leave if I'm uncomfortable." He says, "Yeah, that's great. I'll see you there." Mark shows up to Rickon's and he says he doesn't have the book for the book reading. Rickon then says, "You don't need to drive all the way home unless you want to." Then he says Rebecca, someone in the audience, might be willing to share hers, but he should ask her or she might be offended. Mark then tells Devin that they should talk later because he is considering a pretty decent-sized life change. Miss Selvig/Cobell then shows up. Back to Dylan. He uses Mr. Grainer's key card to access the security room to continue his plan. Irving is painting, hopped up on caffeine per usual. Mark is talking with Mrs. Selvig, and he said he's glad that she's there, and he tries to cheer her up. Dylan then ties the door shut to buy himself some extra time when security finds out what he's doing. He then enters all the prompts from the directions of the overtime contingency in the manual. He types all their names up and he gets a countdown warning to finish the prompts. He does so. We flash to Mark and Cobell speaking. She is wondering about his life change. He says he's thinking he might quit Lumen. He says he's not sure he even needs Severance anymore. She hugs him and seemingly looks very happy for him in the moment. Back to Dylan, man on a mission. He reaches for both levers, one with the left hand, one with the right hand, which is why 2 people are typically needed to do the overtime contingency. He manages to get a hand on each of them and pull both levers. This wakes up Irving, Helly, and Mark to close the episode. And in the little flash we got to see with Helly, she's all dialed up for a special occasion, which we find out exactly what it is next episode, the season finale.
Episode 9 is the season finale, and it's called The We Are, which is a play on the You Are, which is Rickon's book. Last week, we left off with Dylan activating the overtime contingency. Then we see Irving, Helly, and Mark all wake up at the same time. The camera immediately pans to Mark, and it shows how he deals with the conversation that he is having because he's talking to Miss Cobell. The first sentence he hears her speak is, "Talk with your sister. It's an important decision." He says, "My sister?" She questions if he's okay. He says that he's a little woozy and he needs to use the bathroom, but he starts walking the wrong way, and Cobell has to correct him and say, no, the bathroom's that way. Then we see Irv. He wakes up realizing that he is painting and listening to really loud rock music. He looks around and notices all of his artwork, which is basically the same hallway painted over and over again. Then we finally see Helly. It was a cliffhanger last week, seeing her all dressed up, and now we see who she's talking to. It's Natalie. And then Natalie says, we need you nimble. You're on in 20. She then introduces her to a woman named Gabby, who's the same woman that Devin met at the birthing retreat, who is the senator's wife. So Natalie introduces Helly to Gabby as Helena Egan. She's an Egan. The camera then focuses back on Dylan, who's really picking up the slack this episode for everybody else. He's stretching with both arms stretched out as far as he can possibly reach to keep the OTC going. Mark is in the bathroom trying to get his bearings straight to figure out where he is. He says to himself, okay, where am I? And then Devin walks in with a baby. So he doesn't know whose baby that is. He wonders if it's his. And he says, how's our baby? Devin says, you mean how it takes a village? Then she says she wants to have the life change talk with him, but she needs to pump first. Then we see Irv. He's walking around his place and he sees that he has a dog named Radar. This name was brought up in a wellness session with Miss Casey when she was telling him things about his Audi. Then Mark sees some random couple who ask him questions of his sister, and he says, my sister? And he learns who Devin truly is. He then excuses himself from the conversation and walks away. Rebecca walks up to Mark and says, so I'm told to share my book with you. Mark is still really confused by all this, but he just says, yeah. He then finds Devin, and she says she's ready for the life talk change. He says, we're close, right? We need to talk. She says they can talk at the first reflection break during the book reading since it's that serious. Helly, or Helena now, I guess, asks Gabby how many kids she has. She says, just gave birth to my third. Should have stopped at 2. Helly says, wow, 3 kids? She replies, couldn't have done it without a little help. This confirms Devin's theory. So Devin thought that this woman specifically was severed to carry her pregnancy. And this turns out to be true. Gabby then goes on to say, I can't believe people want to outlaw Severance. Helly agrees with her, but we know how she truly feels. This episode does a really good job of going back and forth between Irv, Helly, and Mark to show what they're all up to, and Dylan, showing that he's just staying strong throughout this. So they quickly go back to Irv, and he notices all these war medals and other accolades hanging on his walls. So we're slowly learning more and more about Irving as this episode goes on. Really, the only person that we knew anything of his Audi was Mark before this. So we're all kind of learning more about each and every one of them little by little as this episode plays out. And the director, Ben Stiller, did a great job in pacing this episode. Angelo, the senator who's married to Gabby, he said he's very impressed with the photo display. There's a bunch of photos of Helly, which is all propaganda, which shows her looking like she's in a good mood. And this shows what Milchek was really up to. So every time he was taking a photo, it was for this Egan family gala. He was supposed to make it look like Helly was always happy while she was severed. And Helly starts to notice that this is all much bigger than she initially had prepared for. And you can tell by her face, she's a bit overwhelmed at the moment. Angelo then says to Helly, let's change some minds. And Helly says, well, I'm certainly going to try. Angelo then says, please thank your father if you see him. Helly says that she will. Rebecca then calls Mark to sit next to her so they can share the book for Rickon's reading. Rickon dedicates the reading to his daughter, Eleanor. Then he begins to read from his book. Cobell slides right next to Mark and says, hey, can I read from this book as well? He says, sure. Right back to Helly. Like I said, the pacing is phenomenal in this episode because the camera focuses right on Helly just as Rickon reads the line, who are you? It's a perfect transition. Then we see more of the propaganda prepared for the Egan family gala. It's just several photos of Helly smiling, looking like she's always having fun at work, when the reality is she threatened to chop off her fingers. She tried to commit suicide. It was complete difference from what they're making it out to look like. The sign reads Helly, a Severance story. Irving then opens a box and he finds a uniform from the U.S. Navy along with a photo of his father. So we find out all the memorabilia all around his apartment all belong to his father, who was in the Navy. He then digs deeper as Rickon goes back to reading. Rickon then says, let's take a 7-minute reflection break. As Rebecca says, that was transformative. I'm going to have to change my name again. Rickon and Mark then talk for a little bit, and Rickon confides in Mark that he's worried that the night is going badly. But remember, Mark's Ennie loves this book. He was never even allowed to read anything else. So he had this book and he kept it sacred to him and he read it as often as he could. So he really looks up to Rickon. His Ennie does anyway. And his Audi never even got to read the book. So this is really confusing Rickon. Rickon says, "You actually read my book?" And Mark says, "The book changed my life." And then he goes on to say, "Rickon, are we friends?" And then Rickon kind of takes this in a positive manner. And then he goes on to say, "I don't blame you for choosing Severance. You had to deal with tragedy in whatever way suited you. And I respect you for that." And they share a nice moment together. And it seemed like Rickon was always looking to have this type of conversation with Mark, and he finally got it. Cobell then goes up to Mark and says, "You seemed tense during our hug." Because remember, his Innie woke up mid-hug. So he tensed up right when that happened. She then says, "Did you mean what you meant before about your plans? Tell me more." She's trying to see if he remembers what they were talking about. But he says, "I'll be right back, okay?" Then he says, "Thanks, Miss Cobell." He gives it up. He doesn't know that she's going by the name Mrs. Selvig, calls her Miss Cobell. So then right there, Miss Cobell knows that's Mark's Innie. That is not Mark Scout's Audi. Devin then asks Miss Cobell to watch the baby as she goes and talks to Mark. She hands the baby off, and then Mark and Devin are finally alone. But we go right back to Helly. She sees her Audi speaking propaganda on video, and you can see in her face that she's starting to absolutely lose it. But you can tell her father had a lot of influence on her on the way she spoke about her father in these interviews. Then we see Cobell is in her car speeding back to Lumen. We don't know if she has the baby in her car, but we're led to believe it at this point in time. She's calling Milchek. He will not answer. Next scene, we find out what Irv found underneath his father's Navy uniform and picture, and it turns out his Audi has been up to a lot of work behind the scenes. He had names, addresses, and a bunch of information on other severed employees. He flips through the documents and finds that he has Bert's address and his name clearly marked off on the map. So maybe they knew each other. We don't know at this point. Helly then tries to gather herself and find some space, but ends up being found by her father, James Egan, the current CEO of Lumen. He says she looks lovely. He asks if she's still in pain because he knows about the attempt on her life that her Innie made. He said he can't believe that happened to her, but thank you so much for going through with this. Your grandfather would cherish what you've done. Basically, praise Kier. He asks if she'll be all right for her speech. He talks about the first chip he ever brought home. She said, "It looks so pretty, Daddy. Everybody in the whole world should get one." And then James says, "Now they will, because of you. They will all be Kier's children." He leaves and she tries to calm herself. So now we get the general idea of what Lumen is really trying to do in the grand scheme of things. Back to Irv, he's trying to find his car keys. He does. Then he grabs the map that his Audi had made. He grabs his coat and he heads out the door to try to find his car. He gets in his car and we quickly find out that he has no idea how to drive, but he figures it out because nothing's going to stop him from getting to Bert's house right now. Then we see Mark and Devin. Mark had already told Devin about everything by the time we see him again, and Devin is reacting to all this information that she just found out. She said that his Audi has been trying to figure out what Lumen does. He says he just wants to know why he's in there in the first place. Devin goes on to tell him, "Well, you lost your wife a little before you started working at Lumen." And she says that it was a car accident. She says that he tried teaching. Mark says, "I was a teacher?" She says, "Yeah, but you tried teaching again. It was a disaster because the accident was still very much so in your veins. That's why you got the job at Lumen, to be spared from any further pain." Then he learns his wife's name was Gemma, and he says that was a nice name. Devin says, "Yeah, we were all very close. It was really nice." Then we see Irv on the road, map in hand, eyes on the road, when just then Cobell speeds right by him, headed to Lumen. She calls Milchek again and again when finally he answers. He says, "Hey, I'm not supposed to talk to you right now." But Cobell screams, "The OTC has been triggered. Mark S. is his Innie." Milchek says, "Impossible." She says, "It's Dylan. They've been planning it all along." Milchek says Helly's at the gala. She says, "Get to the security office and shut it off now. I'll take care of Helly." Then we see Milchek bolting towards the security office. He tries to open the door, but Dylan's tie stops him for now. Milchek tries to reason with Dylan, but Dylan just screams, "Fuck you, Mr. Milchek." Devin and Mark are then chatting about what to do, and they both agree that they should be careful about the situation. He doesn't know how much time he has. He doesn't know when his Audi's going to wake back up. But then he remembers that Cobell's there, and he says, "Hey, why is Cobell here? And Devin says, who? And he says, the woman in the flowery purple outfit. And Devin says, are you talking about Mrs. Selvig? And Mark says, yeah, but her name is Cobell. Devin runs right out the door looking for Mrs. Selvig, Cobell, whatever you want to call her at this point, because she left her kid with her. She runs right out into the living room and interrupts the reading and says, where's Mrs. Selvig? She yells, Eleanor, we need to find her right now. They all run outside and find out that her car is gone, and everyone erupts into chaos looking for Eleanor. Milchek is still trying to reason with Dylan. He's saying there's prizes you don't even know about, and he'll get him a coffee cozy as soon as he opens up this door. Dylan screams right back on him, I want to remember my kids being fucking bored. Milchek claims he has 2 other kids, and he'll tell them their names if he just opens up the door. Then Cobell arrives back to Lumen and rushes inside while Helly is headed towards the stage. Her speech starts in just 2 minutes, according to Natalie, as she preps her on what to say. Irv, still parked out front, sees inside Bert's house, and he sees he's with another man, and he looks very happy. Right back to Mark. He finds the baby, but then another guest comes in and oddly says, I found your child. I'm the one that found her. So that guy was super strange. But then Milchek gets closer and closer to breaking in, but Helly is on stage at this point. Right at the point that Helly gets on stage, Mark sees a photo that really catches his eye. Cobell gets to Helly and says, is it you? Helly says, I'm going to kill your company. Cobell says, my company? Think about what you're doing. She claims that all her friends, Irving, Dylan, and Mark, are all going to suffer in pain if she tells the truth. They will just torture them for the remainder of their shifts at Lumen. We cut back to Mark. He picks up the photo. Just then, Helly walks on stage. Her father is looking on. Mark looks at the photo. Then we, as the audience, see that he learns that Miss Casey is actually his wife. So now he puts 2 and 2 together. She's not dead, and he has to go tell someone. So he runs out of the room. So 3 things are happening at once. Mark's running towards the living room to go tell someone that his wife is actually alive. Irving is walking towards Bert's door, and Helly's about to give her speech. All the while, Milchek is still trying to break in the security office. This is a really great finale. Irving approaches the door. Milchek closes in. Mark runs in screaming his sister's name. Helly starts her speech, and right off the bat, she says that everything about Severance is a lie. The crowd actually laughs. They think she's joking. Irving is banging on Bert's door, screaming Bert's name. Mark is still running looking for his sister, screaming her name. And then Helly says, no, listen, we're not happy. We're miserable down there. They torture us. We're prisoners. And as she says that line, she's tackled. And at the same time, Dylan is tackled, which stops the overtime contingency. But right before OTC was stopped, Mark screams out, she's alive, to end season 1. So that's it for season 1 of Severance. I absolutely love this show. I want to thank the Recaps for having me. I've been Dan from Scene Invaders. We have a podcast called Scene Invaders and a YouTube channel called Scene Invaders. So if you'd like to see some of that, we drop weekly videos and we do a weekly podcast. So if that sounds interesting to you, check it out. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time.